The papacy begins not in grandeur, but in blood. Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, became the first bishop of Rome and by tradition the first pope. His importance wasn't based on wealth, armies, or political power, it was his link to Christ. According to Scripture, Jesus told him, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." That phrase became the cornerstone of papal authority for centuries to come. In life, Peter was a fisherman, not a scholar or politician. But his leadership among the apostles gave the early Christian community direction at a time when it was under constant threat from the Roman Empire. He eventually traveled to Rome, the heart of the empire, to spread the faith. There, during the persecutions of Emperor Nero, Peter was arrested and sentenced to death. Tradition says he was crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. Peter left no wealth or palaces behind, but his martyrdom gave the Roman Church its unique authority. Unlike other Christian communities spread across the Mediterranean, Rome had the legacy of Peter. Over time, this memory of martyrdom and sacrifice would become the justification for why the Bishop of Rome should be considered supreme over other bishops. The papacy would later evolve into a position of immense political power, but in Peter's time, it was about survival, faith, and leadership under persecution. Peter's death also set a pattern that shaped how the church saw itself, a willingness to suffer and even die for the truth of its message. For centuries, popes after him claimed his authority, calling themselves the successors of Peter. This idea, that their power was not merely human but divinely ordained, would define the papacy in both glory and scandal for the next 2,000 years. If Peter gave the papacy its spiritual roots, Leo I was the first to show what it could mean in practice. Known as Leo the Great, he transformed the Bishop of Rome from one local church leader into a figure who claimed authority over the entire Christian world. His timing was crucial. The Western Roman Empire was collapsing under barbarian invasions, and people were looking for stability. When Attila the Hun threatened Rome in 452, it wasn't the emperor who stood before him, it was Pope Leo. Accounts say Leo's presence and negotiation persuaded Attila to turn back. Whether that's fully true or not, the story itself cemented the Pope as a protector not just of faith, but of Rome itself. Leo also argued that the Pope held supreme authority over other bishops, grounding his claim in the legacy of Peter. He wrote that Peter still spoke through his successors. This was a bold new vision. The papacy wasn't just first among equals, it was the head of the church. That idea would shape every major battle for power between Rome and other churches for centuries. Leo's theological influence was equally lasting. His writings on Christ's nature were adopted at the Council of Chalcedon, a turning point that defined Orthodox Christianity. Through him, the papacy became not just a spiritual office, but also a political and intellectual one. By the time Leo died, the Bishop of Rome had stepped into a role far beyond its beginnings, a pope who could speak for the faith, protect his people, and claim divine authority. In short, he showed the world that the papacy could be a throne as much as it was a pulpit. Gregory stepped into power at a time of chaos. The Western Roman Empire had fallen, Italy was plagued by famine and plague, and waves of invasions left Rome in ruins. Instead of retreating, Gregory turned the papacy into the backbone of survival for both the city and the wider church. He reorganized church lands using their income to feed the poor, care for refugees, and fund defense. For many Romans, it wasn't the emperor or any king who provided stability, it was the pope. Gregory's hands-on approach established the papacy as a practical as well as spiritual authority. Beyond Rome, he thought globally. Gregory sent missionaries to England, beginning the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons and laying the foundations of Christianity in Northern Europe. He also supported missions elsewhere, setting a precedent that the Pope could direct the spread of faith far beyond Italy. Culturally, Gregory left a deep imprint. The style of liturgical singing, later called Gregorian chant, was associated with him, even if he didn't compose it directly. His writings, particularly the Pastoral Rule, became guides for bishops on how to shepherd their flocks. By his death, Gregory had shown how the papacy could rise above political collapse and become a unifying force across nations. He didn't rule an empire, but he acted like a statesman, protector, and teacher. It's no surprise he was later called the Great, one of only two popes ever given that title. John the XII is remembered as the first truly nefarious pope, a man whose reign marked a dark turn for the papacy. He was elected at just 18, chosen not for holiness but because of his powerful Roman family. From the start, his papacy revealed how easily the office could be seized and corrupted by politics. Chroniclers of the time described shocking scenes. The Lateran Palace, once the papal residence, was said to have been turned into a place of gambling, violence, and open vice. John was accused of keeping mistresses, committing acts of brutality, and treating sacred offices as things to be bought and sold. Even if some accounts were exaggerated, the picture was one of moral collapse at the very heart of the church. His political dealings only deepened the scandal. In 962, he crowned Otto I as Holy Roman Emperor, yet soon after plotted against him. Otto retaliated, marching into Rome and gathering a council that deposed John on charges of blasphemy, perjury, and corruption. Though John managed to reclaim power briefly, his reign ended abruptly. He died young, reportedly in the bed of another man's wife. A fitting end in the eyes of his critics to a disgraceful papacy. John XII's time in office shattered the image of the Pope as a spiritual father and protector. Instead, he embodied the dangers of an office held by someone driven by desire, greed, and politics. After centuries of seeing the papacy as a moral guide, Europe was confronted with the reality that the office could just as easily fall into the hands of a man who corrupted it for himself. Boniface VIII was one of the most ambitious popes in history, and also one of the most despised. His reign marked the peak of papal claims to absolute power, but also the moment when those claims began to collapse. To his enemies, he was nothing less than the Antichrist. Boniface inherited a papacy that had grown wealthy and politically influential, but he took the idea of papal supremacy further than most of his predecessors dared. In 1302, he issued the bull Unam Sanctum, declaring that every human creature was subject to the Pope for salvation. It was a bold, uncompromising vision of spiritual and political authority rolled into one. The trouble was, kings no longer accepted such sweeping claims. His fiercest opponent was Philip IV of France. Boniface demanded taxes and obedience from Philip, while Philip accused the Pope of corruption and even heresy. The conflict escalated until 1303, when French forces stormed Boniface's residence at Anagni. He was captured, humiliated, and though later released, he died soon after. The outrage of Anagni, as it became known, symbolized the breaking point of papal power. Boniface's enemies used fiery language to condemn him, branding him the Antichrist. Dante consigned him to hell in the Divine Comedy while he was still alive. His arrogance and downfall exposed the limits of papal authority at a time when nation-states like France were rising. After Boniface, the papacy entered one of its weakest phases. Within a few years, it would leave Rome entirely for Avignon, beginning nearly 70 years of exile under French influence. If earlier popes like Leo and Gregory built the papacy into a universal power, Boniface revealed just how fragile that power could be when pushed to extremes. By the early 15th century, the papacy had sunk into chaos. For nearly 40 years, there had been multiple popes at once, one in Rome, another in Avignon, and, for a time, even a third claimant in Pisa. This was the Western Schism, a crisis that fractured Christendom and left ordinary believers confused about who the true pope really was. Martin V's election in 1417 brought that nightmare to an end. At the Council of Constance, the Church gathered to resolve the schism by deposing or accepting the resignations of rival claimants. The cardinals then chose Oddone Colonna, who took the name Martin V. His election restored unity, finally giving the Catholic world one universally recognized pope again. Martin was not a great reformer or a visionary, but his importance lay in stabilizing the office. He re-established the papacy in Rome, repairing the Lateran Palace and rebuilding Rome's status as the center of the Church. Politically, he worked to restore papal prestige, forming alliances with European rulers to rebuild the Church's influence. Still, his reign highlighted a lingering weakness. Though the papacy was united again, calls for reform were growing louder. Many hoped the Council of Constance would usher in a new era where councils, not popes, would hold ultimate authority. Martin rejected this idea, reasserting papal supremacy. The problem of corruption and abuse was not solved, and within a century, the Reformation would erupt. Martin V's legacy is one of repair, not renewal. He healed the wound of the schism and brought the papacy back to Rome, but he left many deeper problems unresolved. Unity had been restored, but reform was postponed. Few names in papal history provoke as much infamy as Alexander VI. Born Rodrigo Borgia, he became the symbol of corruption, nepotism, and scandal at the heart of the Renaissance Church. His election in 1492 was itself tainted. He was widely believed to have bought the papacy through bribery and promises of favor. Once in power, Alexander used the papacy as a tool for his family's advancement. His children, Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, became notorious figures in their own right, tied to rumors of poisonings, affairs, and ruthless ambition. Alexander openly promoted his family into powerful positions, turning the papacy into something closer to a dynastic monarchy than a spiritual office. His private life scandalized Rome. He openly acknowledged his mistresses and fathered multiple children, living in a way that seemed to mock the Church's teachings on celibacy and morality. To his critics, he embodied everything wrong with the papacy: greed, lust, and worldliness. Yet Alexander was not without ability. He was a skilled politician, navigating the volatile landscape of Renaissance Italy, where France, Spain, and the Italian city-states all fought for dominance. He also sponsored artistic projects, supported education, and even drew the papal line, dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal in the Treaty of Tordesillas. But these achievements are overshadowed by his reputation. To many, Alexander VI confirmed that the papacy could be bought and corrupted, more a prize of power than a spiritual calling. His reign left a stain on the Church that reformers like Martin Luther would soon seize upon. When people later accused the papacy of being worldly and corrupt, it was Alexander's face they imagined. Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, was never meant to reform the Church. He was meant to enjoy it. Coming from the wealthy and powerful Medici family of Florence, he entered the papacy with a taste for luxury, art, and splendor. His reign is remembered less for holiness than for indulgence, both personal and financial. Rome under Leo X became a center of Renaissance culture. He sponsored Raphael and Michelangelo, commissioned lavish building projects, and turned the Vatican into a glittering showcase of art and power. But this grandeur came at a price. The papal treasury was soon drained, and Leo turned to one of the most notorious practices in church history to raise funds: the sale of indulgences. Indulgences were certificates promising the reduction of time a soul would spend in purgatory. In theory, they were tied to repentance and good works. In practice, under Leo, they became a money-making enterprise. Preachers like Johann Tetzel were sent across Europe selling them with slogans that promised salvation for coin. The scandal was immense, and it struck a nerve with a German monk named Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther posted his 95 Theses, openly challenging indulgences and papal corruption. Leo X dismissed Luther at first as a drunken monk who would sober up, but he underestimated the movement he had unleashed. When Luther refused to recant, Leo excommunicated him in 1521. By then, the Reformation had begun, splitting Christianity into Catholic and Protestant camps, divisions that remain to this day. To his admirers, Leo was a patron of the arts and a symbol of Renaissance brilliance. To his critics, he was the pope who sold salvation and brought the Church to the brink of collapse. Martin Luther called him the very Antichrist. More than any pope before him, Leo X showed that the excesses of Rome could provoke not just scandal, but revolution. Pius IX, born Giovanni Maria Mastai Ferretti, holds the record as the longest reigning pope, over 31 years. His papacy spanned a century of revolutions, nationalism, and change, and he responded by redefining the papacy as a fortress of authority in an unstable world. At first, Pius was seen as a reformer. Early in his reign, he granted political amnesty, encouraged limited liberal reforms, and raised hopes that the Church might modernize with the times. But the revolutions of 1848 changed everything. Pius was forced to flee Rome when Republican forces rose up, and when he was restored by French troops, he abandoned liberalism and turned sharply conservative. From then on, he saw modern political movements as enemies of the Church. The most dramatic political change came in 1870, when Italian nationalists captured Rome and stripped the Pope of his temporal power. The Papal States, which popes had ruled for centuries, ceased to exist. Pius declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican, refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the new Italian kingdom. This loss marked the end of the papacy as a territorial monarchy. Spiritually, Pius responded by strengthening papal authority. In 1854, he declared the Immaculate Conception of Mary as dogma. Most importantly, in 1870, he presided over the First Vatican Council, which proclaimed papal infallibility, the teaching that the Pope, when speaking ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals, could not err. This defined the modern papacy as a supreme spiritual authority, even as its political power crumbled. Pius IX's reign was controversial. To his supporters, he was a defender of faith in a hostile age. To his critics, he was stubborn and reactionary, shutting the Church off from progress. But his decisions reshaped the papacy, making it less about ruling territory and more about ruling doctrine, a change that still defines it today. Pius XII, born Eugenio Pacelli, became pope on the eve of the Second World War. His papacy would be defined by that conflict and by the shadow of the Holocaust. To this day, his actions during the war spark fierce debate. Was he a cautious diplomat protecting the Church, or a moral leader who failed to speak out clearly enough against Nazi atrocities? When war broke out, Pius tried to act as a mediator. He called for peace, condemned aggression in general terms, and used Vatican diplomacy to aid negotiations. But he avoided direct public condemnations of Hitler or Nazi Germany, fearing that doing so might provoke even harsher persecution of Catholics in occupied Europe. Instead, he worked quietly. Vatican channels were used to shelter Jews, assist refugees, and provide intelligence to the Allies. Thousands of Jews found hiding places in convents and monasteries under papal instruction. Yet silence can be as powerful as speech. Critics argue that Pius never used his position to openly denounce the Holocaust while it was happening. His defenders counter that he acted prudently, saving lives behind the scenes while avoiding reprisals that might have worsened the situation. The truth remains complex, and the debate over his wartime role continues even now, especially as Vatican archives are gradually opened. After the war, Pius XII positioned the papacy as a moral voice against communism, condemning atheistic regimes in Eastern Europe and strengthening the Church's alignment with the West during the Cold War. He also fostered Marian devotion, declaring the Assumption of Mary as dogma in 1950. Pius XII left behind a divided legacy. To some, he was a cautious diplomat who chose prudence over prophecy. To others, his silence made him complicit in humanity's darkest crimes. His papacy remains one of the most morally complex chapters in Vatican history. When Cardinal Karol Wojtyła of Poland was elected pope in 1978, he became the first non-Italian pope in over 4 centuries. His election itself was historic, but his impact on the world would be even greater. John Paul II transformed the papacy into a truly global institution, traveling more than any pope before him and becoming one of the most recognizable figures of the 20th century. From the beginning, he was a charismatic presence. His background under Nazi occupation and communist rule in Poland shaped his outlook. He understood what it meant for faith to survive under oppression, and he brought that conviction into his papacy. His first visit to Poland in 1979 electrified his homeland, inspiring the Solidarity movement and contributing to the eventual collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Many credit him as a key figure, alongside leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, in ending the Cold War. But John Paul II's influence went far beyond politics. He made the papacy a visible presence worldwide, traveling to over 120 countries, reaching millions of people face to face. His openness to youth, through events like World Youth Day, made him beloved by younger generations. He also reached out to other religions, famously praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem and becoming the first pope to enter a synagogue. On doctrine, John Paul II was firm. He upheld traditional Catholic teachings on sexuality, marriage, and the priesthood, often clashing with more liberal voices inside and outside the church. Yet he also wrote extensively on human dignity, work, and the value of life, leaving behind a body of writings that continue to shape Catholic thought. In his later years, Parkinson's disease weakened him physically, but he chose to remain in the public eye, turning his suffering into a witness of faith. His long papacy, one of the longest in history, ended with his death in 2005, mourned by millions across the globe. John Paul II left a towering legacy. To admirers, he was a saintly figure who stood against tyranny and brought hope to millions. To critics, he sometimes failed to confront scandals within the church, especially the abuse crisis. But few doubt his stature. He turned the papacy into a global moral voice, one that reached far beyond the walls of the Vatican. When Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina was elected in 2013, he became the first pope from Latin America, the first Jesuit pope, and the first to take the name Francis. His election signaled a shift. The papacy was no longer only a European institution, but truly global. From the beginning, Francis set a different tone. He refused many of the trappings of office, choosing a simple apartment over the papal palace and riding in modest cars rather than limousines. His focus on humility and care for the poor earned him immediate popularity. He often spoke of the church as a field hospital, meant to serve those most wounded by life. Francis also tackled broader issues. His 2015 encyclical Laudato Si called for urgent action on climate change, framing care for the environment as a moral responsibility. He consistently emphasized mercy over judgment, softening the tone on issues like divorce, homosexuality, and interfaith relations. For many, this made him a breath of fresh air in a church often seen as rigid and detached. Yet Francis was also divisive. Conservatives accused him of diluting doctrine and confusing the faithful. His efforts to reform the Vatican bureaucracy and address financial scandals met resistance, and the clerical abuse crisis remained a wound that no pope could easily heal. While he gained enormous popularity outside conservative Catholic circles, inside the church, his leadership often sparked debate. Francis's papacy was also marked by a global presence. He visited war zones, refugee camps, and countries on the margins of the Catholic world, seeking to make the papacy a voice for peace and justice. His style was less about defining doctrine and more about setting a moral tone, reminding the church of its duty to serve. When Francis died in 2025, he left behind a mixed but undeniable legacy, a pope who challenged traditions, reached across boundaries, and redefined the image of the papacy in the 21st century. To admirers, he embodied humility and compassion. To critics, he unsettled a church built on clarity and consistency. But no one could deny that Francis made the papacy a voice heard well beyond its walls.